Hello everyone and welcome to the color breakdown of Interstellar. For those of you who are new to the channel, welcome. I like to break down the color grading of certain movies that I think look interesting, or popular movies, or movies that won Academy Awards, and see if I can match them in DaVinci Resolve to kind of give you guys some insight as to how you can achieve some of the colors that these films are pulling off. Today we're going to be looking at Interstellar, and I'm going to start with some of the technical breakdowns, and then we'll jump into DaVinci Resolve and see if we can break it down adequately. So this movie was shot by Christopher Nolan, known famously for Tenet, Interstellar, Inception, Dunkirk, also known famously for the Batman movies. The cinematographer for Interstellar was Hoyta van Hoytema, a Swedish cinematographer. He's known pretty famously for collaborating with Christopher Nolan on films such as Tenet and Interstellar, which we're looking at today. He also did the cinematography for Ad Astra. I probably said that incorrectly. He also did Dunkirk, also a film directed by Christopher Nolan. And then, of course, a massive body of work. The colorist for Interstellar was a man named Walter Volpato, which I hope I'm pronouncing correctly. He's worked on films such as the most recent Star Wars, The Last Jedi, Dunkirk, again with Christopher Nolan, Homecoming, which I haven't seen, Hustlers, which I also haven't seen. Anyway, we'll see if we can figure out what he's doing in these frames. Alright, before we jump over to DaVinci Resolve, let's take a look at some of the cameras that were used to shoot Interstellar. So the camera that Christopher Nolan used to capture the IMAX format was the Imax MSM camera. I don't know anything about it, so let's see if we can learn something off their website. So far I haven't learned too much, just reading the first paragraph, but it is pretty interesting. They have a behind the scenes picture here, directly from Interstellar. It looks like they also have a frame from Avatar, which I think was around the same time as Interstellar. Looks like it was used on Superman Returns and Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, which is really interesting. It seems pretty intuitive. It's a camera that allows you to shoot in an IMAX format. There's not too much to look at here. So besides learning the technicals of the camera specifically, the obvious benefit of using IMAX is that you get a bigger image. I think it's about 40%. Yeah, about 40% more image than what you would get with a standard camera that's recording in 16:9 or 2:35:1. And then here on IMAX's website are a couple of movies that were shot with the IMAX cameras. Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness, Top Gun Maverick, Jurassic World Dominion. Anyway, that's enough about the IMAX camera. I don't really know enough of the specifics and the technology that goes into it to pretend to teach you guys something that's insightful. So instead of doing that, I'm going to jump over to some of the lenses and see if we can figure out something interesting with those. So for Interstellar, the cinematographer decided to use Panavision's Series C and Series E anamorphic lenses. And I don't know too much about them, but let's see if we can figure something out on Panavision's website. So here's a look at the lens, and I think I saw a 2.8 t-stop, which probably wouldn't introduce as much bokeh as something like a 1.4, like some of the primes today. So we'll see if we can look at the quality of the bokeh and look at how the depth of field is either opened up, kept shallow, or allowed to go a little bit wider. So we'll look at some of the images and see what kind of image is being produced here. So it's compact, lightweight, anamorphic, of course. So it's going to be a wider field of view compared to a spherical lens relative to the same focal length, that's the quality of anamorphic lenses. It's described as having a pronounced anamorphic flare, flattering bokeh. We'll see if we can see some of those qualities. Organic feel, cinematographers prefer it over the sterile look of many modern day optics, which I've heard the Zeiss Super Primes described as just being kind of clinical, sterile, super clean, which is good for certain shoots, but maybe not necessarily narrative shoots. And then overall, the C series come in 9 different focal lengths, with the fastest aperture being T2.3. So it comes with a 35, 40, 50, 60, 75, 100, 150, 180. I'll take a guess at which ones were used, but it looks like the fastest one being the 50mm at t2.3. So that's what's shown here. So that's interesting. Close focus, looks like the closest it focuses is with the 60mm at 20 inches. And the weight is relatively heavy on these, which makes sense. It's a big housing in these lenses, with the heaviest one being 8 pounds, and that's the 180mm. Here's some movies that were shot with the C-Series prime lenses. Bad Times at El Royale, which I think I've seen. Is this the one with Chris Hemsworth? Yeah, I've seen this. The Sun is also a Star. I've never seen that one. Licorice Pizza. No Time to Die. Uncut Gems. Both are really gritty and colorful looking movies. So I wonder if when we look at those movies, if we can find something pretty similar to Interstellar. All right, that's enough of the movies used to shoot with the C-Series. Let's take a look at the E-Series and how they differ from the C-Series. 1980s, I think the other one was 1960s. Yeah, so 1968 is when the C-Series were introduced, and then the 1980s is when the E-Series were introduced. So potentially, if I had to guess, it'd have a faster aperture, probably a little bit lighter, but we'll see if those assumptions are accurate. Anamorphic primes, same thing, anamorphic, not spherical. Building on the success of the C-Series, offered improved optical quality, more sophisticated anti-reflection coatings, newer spherical components, refined optical formula. We'll see if we can discern the difference between the C-Series and the E-Series as they appear in the images in Interstellar. Here's a look at what the housing looks like. Pretty much the same thing. I see that this one's a T2, so it does look like it's a little bit faster. Yeah, the widest aperture being T2, 9 focal lengths, the same as the C-Series. And it looks like it comes in the exact same focal lengths with a 35, 40, 50, 60, 75, 100, 150, and 180. It looks like since the inception of the E-Series lenses, they've only been used to shoot Pokemon Detective Pikachu and Winchester. So they must not be that popular. I'm sure they've been used to shoot a ton of stuff, and it's just not including it. Anyway, that's about it looking at the lenses. What I didn't cover was that they used another film camera called the Millennium XL2. I don't know too much about film cameras, but here's a look at it. I'll see if I can read some of the specifications in case there's somebody in the comments or somebody who's watching the video who knows a lot about film cameras and potentially tell me why it was picked, why it's a good choice for films, stuff like that. So this camera's been used to shoot Bad Times at the El Royale, Wonder Woman 1984, Black Klansman, Licorice Pizza, a lot of the same things that were used for the E-Series lenses, or excuse me, the C-Series lenses. Gets confusing. All right, so now we're going to jump into DaVinci Resolve, import some of the images from ShotDeck, and go through a couple of them. I'll see if I can find a sample clip, maybe something that I've taken with one of my cameras, and go through some of my clips to see if we can tweak them and make it look like it would exist in the same world as Interstellar. Okay, now that I actually have my hard drive, all the images that I show you guys are pulled straight from ShotDeck. If you don't know about ShotDeck, the company scans popular movies and then puts them on their website in certain categories. It's a great way to get inspiration for your next film, or if you just want to look at images, it's great for that too. Technical difficulties. So for Arrival, they had way more images. It looks like for Interstellar, they only had 36. For now, let's break down some of these images and see what we can figure out, if anything. I'm going to break them down based on whether he's on Earth or if he's up in space, because I feel like stylistically it's going to be too different for me to make a consistent color grade. So perhaps I'll just make two, one where he's on Earth, kind of on the farm, and then one where he's up in outer space, because I feel like the looks are too different. Okay, so let's start with these two images right here, because I find them both pretty interesting. I'm going to start correcting them in the same way that I did the last video, which if you haven't seen my Arrival analysis, feel free to jump over and watch that. All we're going to do is correct these back to a neutral look and then kind of reverse engineer the look that's going on here. So the first thing we're going to look at is exposure. And as you can see in this image, it's very dark, but there's nothing that's crushed. Crushed being this white line here. I have the value at 64, and I have the white point at 960, I think, which are where the white points clip and the black points clip if you're looking at video level scopes. So to show you what crushed shadows might look like, all I'd have to do is drag down the black point down here and rest it right on this line here. So going past it, you would lose all that information in the blacks, but resting right on it, it would still be present, but it would be as black as it can be without being crushed. So for this movie, it looks like they set the blacks just slightly above that, so there's still some detail in the shadows. The same thing with the highlights. These images are really contrasty because they have highlights that are almost clipping and they have the darks which are almost crushed. So if they were to push the highlights a little bit more, potentially right here, you would start to lose information. There's not that many highlights in this image, so it's not going to degrade it all that much. Even if I were to push it pretty high, losing that information doesn't really matter. And then for skin tones, to get a more accurate representation, I'm going to throw on a false color. If we were to look at the skin tone, you can see the brightest part, which is right here underneath the eye, is going to be close to 50 IRE, 50% exposure, which is pretty standard for movies now. The standard for broadcast would be like 70, but movies are typically a little bit more moody. They expose the skin about 20% lower than you would for something like broadcast if you were on a news station. And then very quickly you can see it goes from 50 on this bright speck right here down to 40, very quickly down to 30, down to 10, and then dropping down to shadow. So false color is just a way to look more accurately at the values in your shot. So this is a pretty quick fall off from 50 IRE all the way down to 0. But as I said previously, there's still detail in the shadows here. Okay, so this is where it gets a little bit tricky. I'm going to try to break down the color. Knowing that film has certain color characteristics that are difficult to mimic, this might take me a little bit longer than it did for the Arrival video, but we'll see what we can do. What I'm doing right now is adjusting temp and tint to see if I can make some kind of global adjustment to make the image look a little bit more neutral before jumping into my lift, gamma, and gain to see what was adjusted there. So far I've brought down the tints toward green, -24. Temperature, I've brought it down -270. So potentially it's just global adjustments that are going to need to be made. So before I separate the skin into a separate node, this is what I've done so far. I've just brought the tint down a little bit more toward green and the temperature down a little bit. This is before and after. So before, we see a lot of magenta in the skin and a lot of red in the sky, red and reddish yellow. And what we're seeing right now is a sky that's a little bit more neutral. It's a consistent blue across the overcast sky, which I think would be accurate given when this was shot, probably in the morning, something like that. And then if you look at the skin, a lot of that magenta and those reds are pulled out more toward a neutral skin color, but we'll double check that with the vector scope here in a sec. All that I'm doing here is using the qualifier, doing a selection of the skin, and then I'm going to do some adjustments and see if I can qualify just the skin. If not, I can use a power window to facilitate getting it exact. So I'll go through each of these parameters and see what exactly is going to broaden the selection and make it more accurate. Looks like I need to capture more of the lower range, but in doing so, it's also going to highlight this window. So what I'm going to do is just click and drag more of the face. Yeah, let's not do that. Unfortunately, because some of these lower values are equivalent to all the other low values in the frame as well as the black bars, I'm just going to put a mask around this part of the face and then begin to adjust. Alright, so this is taking a little bit longer than I was expecting, but I think I'm going to just call it right here and see what kind of information we can pick up with the vector scope. Okay, so the assumption that I had that the skin tones were pushing more toward magenta seems to have been pretty correct. Even though this isn't the most accurate key that I've ever done, we can see that the colors here are definitely blooming toward magenta. And I'll see if I can grab just this section of his face to confirm that we're not getting any kind of stray information here. Okay, so I've selected just the cheek here, and we have a pretty decent range of value. Especially, this is the brightest point, which was about 50. Let's see if we can pull this in even more. Perfect. So this is a pretty decent key of just this section of the skin. And yeah, we're blooming pretty heavily toward magenta. So I think that was a pretty fair assessment. So let's see if we can counteract that using some of these global adjustments. And then if not, we'll go in and adjust with lift, gamma, gain, and then maybe go into hue versus hue, see if we can make some of those more specific adjustments. Okay, so far it's pretty subtle, but I think we're creating an image which is a little bit more neutral and beginning to understand what's going on with the color in this image. So, as I repeated before, the temperature I've just brought down a little bit cooler. The tint I've brought down to -52 to get rid of a lot of the magenta which was present in the image. The gain I've boosted a little bit more toward magenta because I found that it was a little bit too greenish blue, and I noticed it up here in the clouds. The gamma I've brought down toward green again because then once we pushed the gain toward magenta, there was too much magenta introduced back into the face. So with gamma, we brought that back down toward green to take some of that out. And then for the lift, we very slightly brought it back closer to magenta in order to neutralize the green that was introduced in the shadows when we adjusted gamma. I think we're ready to leave this as it is, jump over to a new frame, and see if some of these changes that we've made are consistent across these frames. That way we can confirm if we're heading in the right direction. So we're going to take a look at this image, which was definitely shot with a different camera. That might have an effect on how we color grade this. But let's just see if some of those changes remain consistent. Already we can see with exposure, it's relatively similar. The black point is just above crushing, leaving enough information in the shadows so that you can explore the image and nothing's crushed. If we were to do that, if we were to crush it, it would look more like this. It's a look that I don't mind. I think it looks pretty cool, but that's not the way they did it. The blacks are lifted just slightly. Same thing with the white point. The brightest part of this image is around 70 IRE. If we wanted to put these white points out here higher, if we wanted to fabricate that, because naturally maybe they weren't, but if we wanted to fabricate it and increase contrast, it would look something like this, which once again doesn't look bad at all. Lower the black point here. That's a really contrasty image, but that's not how this image looks. So we're using anywhere between just below 0 and 70 to 80 IRE, with the skin tones in this image being around, the brightest point being around, once again, 50%, with a pretty fast fall off here, with the nose being around 15-20%, and finally dipping over here with the hair close to black. So the contrast ratio in the face is with the brightest point being around 50% IRE, and then getting really close to black down here with the hair. We can tell in this image that there's not as much grain as the one in this image. Once again, I guess that's the difference between IMAX and this 35mm camera that we have here. I'm going to start to make some of those global adjustments and keep it consistent. We'll see if we can begin to correct that other image toward neutral. So I'm going to bring this down. Maybe not as much, but -21, let's see that. This image looks really warm. It could just be a skin, but we'll bring this down a little bit. Okay, so after making some of those corrections, which I'll go over, um, and I definitely mimicked some of the corrections that I made in the previous slide, which makes me think that we're onto something here. So after making those corrections, I think this is closer to a neutral image compared to this right here. And as we toggle between these two, we can see that especially up here in the window, let me use my mouse here, especially up here in the window, at the back of the car, the side window here, and then on his face right here, we can see that there's like a really prominent yellow hue, which once corrected is closer to a neutral, like a white. The look on his face is not as prominent. It's not as yellow, that's all I'm trying to say. And then if you look up here on his rear view mirror, we can see that it's also pushing toward yellow, green, and then that's neutralized. And in the shadows, same thing. We've made the adjustments in the highlights and the midtones, and then we're just correcting out those adjustments in the shadows so that we don't see a greenish hue or anything like that in the shadows. So I think this is closer to a neutral kind of look. So I think we're onto something here. Let me go over some of the adjustments that I made. So for this one, temperature, once again, has been brought toward introducing more blue, so it was a little bit too yellow to begin with. The tint, we've brought it toward green. So originally there was too much magenta in this image. With our lift, we've brought it toward magenta only because in the midtones we introduced a lot of green to correct his face. So we had to subtract that from the shadows, and we did that here. The gain, we had to introduce quite a bit of magenta because in the original image it was a bit too green. So what we've seen in the past two images are an image which is generally too magenta, which is something that I noticed, generally a bit warm, and generally has highlights which are a little bit green, just slightly, midtones which are magenta, and shadows which are slightly green. So I think we're moving towards something pretty interesting. We'll see if we can bring up another one of these frames to confirm the theory I have. Which one can we do? Something that's a little bit brighter. Let's see what we can do with this wide shot and see if it has some of those same characteristics. If I can get DaVinci to work right. Alright, I'm just going to make some of those standard adjustments and see what happens. See if we're creating something that's consistent. So exposure first. Once again, let me look at this. So this time we actually have blacks which are touching the black point, probably because this image just has so much dynamic range. They could have pumped light into here to raise the black point a little bit. If we raise that slightly, you'll see how it adjusts this right here. But it's okay, it's contrasty, that's fine. With the bright points being on the horizon line here, and that is just below clipping. So if we raised it up a little bit, it'd be at white, but they kept it just below. All right, so with exposure, we're gonna bring it up slightly. For color, we're gonna make the same standard adjustments, which is bringing the tint toward green. And this image looks way greener than the other ones. But we'll see if it works. Temperature, we found most of these images to be a little bit warm. So let's bring this one down. Tint, I'm actually going to correct on this one. I'm going to leave it as it is. There's so much green in the image that I don't think my theory is going to hold up for that one. I'm going to play around with some of the midtones here. I'm toggling on and off the RGB picker value so that I can see what's more prevalent here in these black points. Looks like red is slightly more prevalent, but these numbers are really close to matching, meaning that there's not a channel that's more prevalent in the blacks than should be. So for red, I'll just do minus there. 876, perfect. I can do -1, 586. Yeah, let me just do that. Okay. Wow, look at that adjustment. Okay, let's toggle what we're doing here. So before and after, it looks like I am correct in assuming that most of these images are a little bit too warm. So look at the difference here between the overall image, which is super warm. It almost feels sepia when I do these adjustments, or sepia. I don't know how it's said. It doesn't matter. Before and then after, you can especially see it up here in the clouds. They're very warm, very green, which is the opposite of the images that had Matthew McConaughey as kind of the focal point. These are now running, they're running warm, which is consistent, but these are now running a little bit greener. And that just goes to show that color grading isn't like a one size fits all. You're going to have to manipulate per image, because some images you want to have a different look depending on how the movie is progressing. But that just goes to show everything that I'm doing. Don't think that there's like a trick that you can throw on, with the same look for every movie. That's not how it works. I'm seeing if there's a consistent theme. So far, there kind of seems to be with the close-ups, but for this, clearly it's different. So for this image, I've added a lot of blue in the temperature, and I've added a lot of magenta into just the general tint. What I've done for the gain is introduce some blue, because especially up here in the clouds, they were way too green. For the gamma, I've added some yellow back, because everything down here was looking a little bit too blue. So it's a game of push and pull, and a lot of it's just using your eye to see what's going to look more natural. And obviously, this image compared to that, this one's going to look way more natural. Okay, so lift, I made super tiny adjustments. As you can see, there's not even a value assigned to it. It just has the negative sign, which means there has been an adjustment, but it's not big enough to denote anything. Whereas you can see the numbers begin to appear there. And the way that I check the blacks is just bringing up the RGB value and seeing that the numbers are really similar, which they are, 776, meaning that there's no color prevalent in the blacks. We can do the same thing for the whites, but these are really consistent here. It looks like there's a little bit of red, a little bit of the red channel that isn't present up here in the whites. Maybe we can go to our HDR function and go to highlight potentially and introduce a little bit of red. 199, 205, 215, 217. So that's getting closer. Sure, it's too small of an adjustment for me to make any kind of categorical difference. But anyway, the general image has definitely been corrected toward a more neutral color palette. And the reason why I do all these is, once again, like I said, to reverse engineer the color grading that's happening in this movie. So if we know that they're pushing, if I go back to this image, if we know that they're pushing more magenta into the image, more warmth into the image, if we know that they're pushing their highlights toward green, if we know that their midtones are pushed toward magenta, if we know that their shadows are pushed toward green, we can make those adjustments in our images and copy a look to the best of our ability. We can start to introduce characteristics that they did for this, albeit we're using different cameras, different lenses, different sets, different costuming. Everything's going to be different, but we can begin to break down these movies, see what they're doing, and then kind of influence the LUTs that we create for our movies or the color grading that we do for our scenes. So since this one's ran pretty long, and since there's such a massive variety of images here, all with wildly different looks. I think I'm going to break this down into a two-part sequence because I really want to get into some of these space scenes here. And these are just, I mean, it's such a clean look. I can tell that it's massively different from something like these images here. So I want to see what's going on with these images, but I don't want this video to run over an hour or something like that. So I think for now we're going to call it. I'll make this into a two-part video, and I'll also introduce some images of my own and see if I can begin to correct it in the way that would match something like this. And I think that'll also show the limitations of not having the correct set, not having the right costuming, not having an actor who potentially is not tan enough, something like that. There's no way to match this in its entirety, and that's okay, but we're gonna get pretty close. So if you like this video, feel free to check out my other video where I broke down Arrival, kind of the color grading that was going on there. Also, feel free to jump over to my website, which is recroommedia.com, and I'll link it down below. If you guys want to see other movies analyzed, just leave that in the comments. Right now, I have a pretty big list of movies that I've downloaded from ShotDeck, but if there's anything you guys want to see now, just let me know and I can kind of push it forward. Besides that, if you have any other questions, just let me know. But that's it. Have a good one.